The radio operators at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor worked in a world measured not in miles or maps, but in fragments. 5-digit groups marched across rice paper pads like cryptic insects. Men with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers leaned over headphones, listening to the static blurred heartbeat of an empire. In the spring of 1943, when the South Pacific steamed like a kettle and the Solomon Islands bled daily, the path to one man's fate began not with a battlefield, but with a whisper. JN 25. The Imperial Japanese Navy's great pride, a cipher built on additives and repetition tables, meant to be unbreakable. It pulsed across the air in confident bursts, carried by transmitters from Rabaul to Truk, from Tokyo's polished map rooms to remote island bunkers hacked from coral and fear. Japan believed its messages vanished into the ether, safe behind mathematics and secrecy. But at Station HYPO, Commander Joseph Rochefort's codebreakers had made a science of shadows. They mapped patterns, counted recurrences, chased statistical ghosts. They lived in a world where a single omitted group or repeated indicator could signal the hinge of history. In early April, the rhythm changed. Traffic from Rabaul thickened, spiked with urgency. Officers leaned closer to the hiss of headsets. Radiomen sharpened pencils. Messages spoke of inspections, of morale tours, of commanders traveling forward. Then, the one line that cut through the static like a blade through silk. A schedule. Depart 0600. Arrive 0930. A name followed, hidden but obvious to the trained mind. Naval General Staff Officer of the Combined Fleet. The honorifics, the precision, the tone of reverence. There was only one man the Imperial Navy spoke of that way, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, cautious strategist, gambler by necessity, the most respected officer in the Japanese military machine, and suddenly, vulnerable, the room grew still. Men who had spent months extracting patterns from noise now faced the rarest of intelligence moments. Clarity, a flight plan, a departure point at Lakunai Airfield, Rabaul, a destination at Balale, a tiny speck near Bougainville, a time window narrow enough to set a watch by. The temptation, like gravity, was irresistible. With that schedule and a fighter capable of ranging that far, the United States could reach across hundreds of miles of ocean and remove the mind that planned Pearl Harbor. But HYPO officers knew the second, harsher equation that came with such gifts. Act on a code break, and the enemy may realize you are reading him. History would later debate whether Yamamoto's mission should have been struck, knowing the risk that Japan might tighten its ciphers, blind the Allies again, stretch the war by months. But in that moment, to the men who had seen smoke rise over Battleship Row and counted the names of friends lost in December 1941, the choice felt less like a dilemma and more like duty. Still, procedure demanded care. The decrypted intelligence travelled not by triumph, but by discipline, passed through channels designed for secrecy. Nimitz approved the operation. The target was not merely a commander, he was a symbol. Removing him would wound Japanese morale and sharpen Allied belief that the tide had turned. Silence sealed the plan. Outside a narrow circle, no one would know the origin of the intelligence. Pilots would be told a plausible lie. Coast watchers had spotted a distinguished visitor's aircraft. They would not question it. At Guadalcanal, in a heat-hazed tent where dust clung to sweat and maps curled in humidity, a quiet man received the assignment. Major soon-to-be Lieutenant Colonel John W. Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron. Tall, calm, the kind of officer who led with precision instead of theatrics. His reputation among 13 Fighter Command was simple. Mitchell planned as methodically as he flew. When information arrived, he asked no unnecessary questions. Orders were orders, targets were geometry. The mission: depart from Henderson Field, fly a dogleg route south of expected search paths, hugging the sea to evade radar. Maintain radio silence. Navigate by dead reckoning across more than 400 miles of open Pacific. Intercept 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers at a point in the sky above Bougainville. Eliminate the lead aircraft. Return. A straight line would have been fatal. The enemy patrolled the direct route. Mitchell traced a curve instead, a wide arc bending like a bowstring, designed to deliver 14 P-38 Lightnings at precisely the right minute, at precisely the right altitude. There was no precedent. No Allied fighter had yet flown so far out, struck so precisely, and returned. The P-38 was chosen because no other fighter in theatre could make the journey. Its twin Allison engines, turbo-supercharged and hungry, would sip fuel from drop tanks until the moment combat demanded violence. The math was unforgiving. One mistake in heading or wind correction, one delayed throttle setting, and they would arrive too soon or too late, and Yamamoto's escorts would not forgive American trespass. Mitchell reviewed wind forecasts, barometric assumptions, compass drift variables. He assigned 4 pilots as the killer section, 10 as top cover. He rehearsed timing until the numbers became a pulse behind his eyes. Then he spoke to his men. He told them only what they needed to know. Discipline in silence, precision in execution, no bravado. "Gentlemen," he said, voice level, "we have a flight to intercept. Timing is everything." In later years, pilots would remember not excitement, but gravity. They understood that the mission smelled of intelligence far above their rank. They did not pry. They trusted Mitchell because Mitchell trusted the math. At 13 Fighter Command, secrecy was muscle, memory. After sorties, men wrote debriefs in crisp detail, reviewing headings, ammunition spent, time on target. Words were measured like fuel. No one bragged. The enemy listened. In the code rooms of Pearl Harbor, Rochefort's team went back to work, pretending nothing had happened. If the Japanese suspected, their cipher might vanish behind new tables, new additives, months of blind searching. The codebreakers lived between pride and fear, between what they achieved and what they could lose. They could not cheer, so they sharpened pencils and waited. In the Solomons, 14 Lightnings gleamed under the tropical sun as armorers checked guns and ground crews wiped oil from the twin booms. Pilots strapped in. Radios went silent. Propellers clawed humid air. The mission lifted like a metallic flock, wheeling east toward ocean and uncertainty. Signals had become weapons. Shadows had become coordinates. A name had become a target. The equation that would change the air war forever was simple on paper, time plus range plus secrecy. But in that still moment, engines roaring like distant thunder, it felt like something heavy of fate balanced on a compass card, history perched on aluminum wings, and the clock had already started. The great secret of that morning over the South Pacific was not only the intelligence that pointed like a dagger, but the machine that could carry it to the heart of the kill. Because long before the P-38 Lightning became a legend, it was a question with wings. Could an American fighter, heavy with fuel and duty, cross oceans, fight and return? Could horsepower become reach, and reach become inevitability? Lockheed's engineers had answered with twin booms, a central nacelle, and an audacious faith in turbo-superchargers. Not one engine, but 2. Not a single vulnerable coolant line, but twin Allisons breathing through stainless steel ducts that curved like metallic arteries. The Lightning looked unlike anything else in the Pacific, sharp, predatory, symmetrical as a hawk's skull. When it taxied, ground crews felt the ground tremble. When it idled, it did not purr. It growled, an animal made of rivets and thick aluminum skin. The Japanese called it 2 planes, 1 pilot. American mechanics simply called it the fork-tailed devil. But on that April mission, myth meant nothing. Math did. And the men in those cockpits knew the numbers like scripture. 2 external drop tanks carrying 165 gallons each. Internal capacity above 250 gallons. Cruise settings carefully balanced. 30 inches of manifold pressure, about 2,100 revolutions per minute. Lean mixture once clear of Guadalcanal's steaming air. Fuel burn calculated for every segment: climb, cruise, intercept, combat, return. Too rich, and they would sputter short of home. Too lean, and a detonation shock through the cylinders could end a life faster than any Zero. Other fighters, P-40s, Wildcats, Corsairs could slash and dive in the Solomons, could wrestle with A-6Ms above jungle rivers and coral reefs. But none could perform this kind of mission. None could thread hundreds of miles of ocean silence and arrive with breath in their lungs and ammunition in their guns. The P-38 did not just fight. It spanned distance like a bridge thrown across emptiness. Its armament was not spread across wings, subject to vibration and harmonization quirks. Everything sat nose straight. A single 20mm cannon, 4 50 caliber Brownings aligned like spears. The P-38 did not need convergence. It did not need luck. A burst at 500 yards placed metal precisely where the sight pointed. A second burst shredded aluminum like paper. The lightning did not nibble. It struck clean, hard, final. Yet its gifts came at a price. The cockpit glass-baked pilots beneath the tropical sun. Engines, when mismanaged, ran hot and unforgiving. Compressibility unknown, poorly understood, waited at high-speed dives like an unseen cliff. Too fast, and the controls stiffened, the nose drove downward, and only careful throttle and trim might save the day. Many pilots learned these dangers in training. Too many never learned them again. Even so, in the Solomons, the P-38 was already proving something no textbook had predicted. It could dictate engagement. It could choose when to appear, when to vanish. Its long legs made it not a participant but a hunter. On Henderson Field, armourers loaded ammunition gently, each belt coiled with deliberate care. Armour plates gleamed behind the pilot's head. Turbochargers spooled with a rising whine. Ground crew checked fuel caps twice, sometimes 3 times. The far ocean had no sympathy for mistakes. There were no lifeboats in the sky. And then there was the sound twin propellers biting humid air, a harmonic beat that rolled across palms and runway like gathering thunder. 14 lightnings lifted one by one, wheels leaving coral dust and climbing into a dawn bruised purple and gold. Every pilot felt the weight, not only fuel, not only weaponry, but the gravity of a mission whispered rather than spoken. They were not chasing a raid, they were not sweeping a shoreline. They were reaching across time and insult, across Pearl Harbor and the long months of jungle defeat, toward a man who believed American fighters could never touch him this deep in the Pacific. Japanese planners had believed the same. Range was their assumption, their shield, their comfort. Distance was supposed to make Yamamoto untouchable. It was supposed to keep the architect safe above palm fronds and island surf. The P-38 shattered that comfort. It proved that engines and discipline could shrink oceans. It proved that geometry could kill. Far below the formation, whitecaps glittered. Sea and sky merged in a great empty blue, unbroken by landmark or mercy. No radio chatter, no laughter, only engines and thought. Pilots trimmed controls, checked clocks, tapped magnetic compasses against vibration. They flew not toward a target but toward a meeting point, a mathematical promise. Time plus bearing plus resolve, that was the equation. The lightning was the instrument. And somewhere ahead, above jungle and coral, 2 G-4M bombers lifted from Rabaul, unaware that across hundreds of miles, an American fighter sleek, silver, improbable had already stolen their future. Dawn broke not with drama but with inevitability, light creeping along the ocean like a hand pushing aside night. The P-38s flew in line abreast, then shifted to combat spread, each pilot holding station by instinct and training. The first hour tested patience, the second hour tested nerves. By the third, men felt time not as minutes but as tension climbing through their shoulders and settling behind their eyes. Silence was discipline. Radios were quiet except for the occasional curt adjustment bearing corrections, engine warnings, fuel checks. Commander John W. Mitchell, flying lead, kept his mapboard locked at his knees. His stopwatch ticked like a heartbeat. He did not look at it often. He did not need to. Every second already lived in his mind. Months of training in navigation, celestial estimates, dead reckoning, and fuel computation had turned him into a human chronometer, their heading 093 degrees, their altitude wave-skimming before they would climb. They flew low, not out of bravado, but necessity. Japanese radar at Buka and Rabaul swept high bands. The P-38s slid beneath like shadows gliding under a door. Below them, the Pacific stretched like an endless steel plate hammered smooth by wind and sun. No islands, no ships, just ocean mocking, eternal, indifferent. If a single engine coughed, if a fuel line cracked, if a prop governor failed, the pilot would descend into that blue void. And there would be no rescue. Not here. Not this far. The men knew it. They accepted it. Not because orders demanded obedience, but because the duty had shape, weight, memory. Pearl Harbor still burned in them not as rage, but as promise. Never again surprised, never again distant. Reach them. In his cockpit, Lieutenant Rex T. Barber checked his instrument panel. Oil temps in the green, manifold pressure steady. His gloved hand rested lightly on the throttle quadrant, feeling vibration like the pulse of a living thing. Barber's face was calm, not from lack of fear, but from concentration so deep it pushed everything else aside. Nearby, Lieutenant Thomas Lanphier adjusted his trim, his eyes shifting between compass and horizon. He had practiced this route in his head all night, tracing imaginary arcs across the Pacific, whispering headings to himself. Others, like Lieutenant Besby Holmes, ran through gunnery sequences in their minds. Lead, fire, burst, reassess. No one thought about glory. They thought about fuel, temperatures, mixture control, and the mathematics of survival. Hours passed. The sun, once gentle, hardened into a hammer. Heat bled through cockpit glass. Sweat gathered under flight helmets, trickled down spines, dampened gloves. But the formation held. To the Japanese crews rising at Rabaul, breakfast rice steamed, tea boiled, and ground crews rolled Yamamoto's G-4M bombers into the tropical morning. They believed the jungle canopy and the Pacific distance formed a shield. They believed secrecy and surprise still lay on their side. They did not know that words coded once, broken twice, stripped of mystery by analysts at Station HYPO and allied cryptologists had betrayed them. At 2 hours and 40 minutes of flight, Mitchell's eyes flicked to his stopwatch, then to the horizon line. Time to climb. He keyed his mic. Climb now. Maintain silence. Engines surged. Propellers bit harder. The lightning formation rose, slow first, then with growing confidence, threaded, upward through hot air currents and humidity haze. They reached altitude not through rush but through discipline, step climbs, fuel lean-out, turbo settings checked, radiators breathing through cowl flaps like iron lungs. At 10,000 feet, the world changed color. Ocean turned cobalt, sky turned pale silver. Heat softened, air thinned, and there, at the edge of heaven and water, the mission sharpened into a single truth. They would meet him. Ahead lay the kill zone plotted from decrypts and Japanese flight timetables. Mitchell's calculations called for interception at nearly the exact minute the Betty bombers would appear. 8 hours of code work, fuel charts, atmospheric tables, distilled into a single point in the sky. A place where fate and mathematics would handshake. Pilots breathed slower, deeper. Hands tightened on control sticks, boots pressed rudder pedals lightly, every sense tuned forward. Then there, tiny specks against the horizon. 4 aircraft. 2 escorts above, 2 bombers below. What began as dots became silhouettes. What were silhouettes became unmistakable outlines. 2 G-4M Bettys, cigar-shaped, glass-nosed, their engines glinting. 2 Zero escorts, sleek, poised, predator graceful. Mitchell raised one hand slightly, signaling visually. No radio. Not yet. Surprise was a blade. Once dull, it could not be sharpened again. The P-38 split. Barber's element curved left. Lanphier's swung right, altitude converting into speed, speed converting into destiny. In Japanese cockpits, crewmen scanned lazy skies. They saw the ocean, the sun, the faint line of Bougainville far to starboard. They did not expect twin-boom hunters carving toward them like silver arrows. On the American side, adrenaline snapped through nerves like electricity. Barber whispered to himself without meaning to, "Steady, wait, not yet." Lanphier checked his sight picture, jaw set hard as steel. His throttle inched forward. The lightning, engines roared not like machines but judgment. Still, silence. Then Mitchell's voice quiet, almost gentle, but absolute. "Execute." 4 P-38s descended as if pulled by gravity and vengeance both. Air screamed along the booms, turbos whined. Guns armed. In that heartbeat before chaos, there existed a stillness, a fragile moment when two worlds remained untouched, history unaltered. Yamamoto sat in his seat reviewing papers, unaware that his schedule had become a death sentence, unaware that across the sky, American pilots rode the precision of invisible mathematicians and the silent work of sleepless cryptanalysts. The lightning noses dropped fractionally, the ocean shimmered, and the distance, once the Empire's shield collapsed into nothing. The hunt had begun. The P-38s did not so much attack as fall toward their prey silent, disciplined, inevitable. Gravity and horsepower braided into one force, sunlight rippled along their wings. Turbochargers, keened. The air itself felt tense, stretched, waiting for violence. Below, the Japanese formation droned steady and untroubled. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, strategist of Midway's failure, believer in the razor-thin margin where honor and annihilation met, sat in his seat, reading a situation report. His staff officer later recalled that Yamamoto's final hours were spent reviewing logistics numbers and personnel rotations. War, to him, was never mystical. It was arithmetic and exhaustion. He had warned his own government once, "I can run wild for 6 months." Now those months were past. He never saw the hunters closing in. Rex T. Barber led the dive left, Thomas Lanphier the dive right, 2 claws converging. Mitchell held top cover, eyes scanning for unseen escorts. Below, the Betty bombers glided like fragile lanterns, thin aluminum skin stretched over ambition. The Zero escorts, 2 specks above, lagged position wrong, altitude wrong. They would not matter in time. Barber's voice came calm, controlled, more exhale than speech. Target in sight. He did not need to add more. The Lightning's guns, armed with metallic clicks, felt through throttle grips. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns across the attacking elements readied to speak in one brutal language. Kinetic certainty. Barber angled in, leading the trailing bomber first to pin the formation. His sight picture slid across canopy glass. His finger tightened. Airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour. Only fractions of a second would separate precision from waste. The first burst roared. Not a stutter, a continuous white-hot river of tracers. Shells tore through the Betty's left engine, fuel tanks rupturing like struck drums. Black smoke belched. The bomber lurched, staggered, then sagged earthward, trailing a ribbon of flame. Barber pulled up, inverted, rolled, then came down again like a hammer seeking another nail. Lanphier, from the right, saw. The lead bomber turned slightly, too slightly. Whether evasive maneuver or coincidence, it placed Yamamoto's aircraft into his sight line. He fired. The 50 calibers walked across sky-bright beads threading fate. Witnesses would argue for decades about who fired the fatal burst. Barber, Lanphier, both. In war, credit is a currency forged in blood and paperwork. But in that moment, accuracy did not matter, impact did. Rounds ripped through the Betty's right engine. A flash, a billow of smoke. Then fire. The thin-skinned Mitsubishi flared like paper held to flame. Fuel tanks ignited. Debris peeled from the fuselage. One wing dipped. The bomber rolled nose down, descending in a long, catastrophic arc toward Bougainville's jungle canopy. Inside, Yamamoto reportedly never stood. His body later recovered, still belted, sword beside him, white gloves unstained by panic. a man who lived by precision, ending in a moment defined by it. The ocean and jungle received him with equal indifference. Japanese escorts reacted late but violently. The two Zeros dove at impossible angles, their pilots screaming into radio static. Trails of tracer fire lanced the air, beautiful and deadly. Mitchell's top-cover elements answered instantly, rolling into defense. Engines roared, wings strained, prop wash curled like smoke. Holmes sighted a Zero on his tail, broke hard, dove, pulled, climbed again. Lightning momentum versus Zero agility, the oldest duel in the Pacific. The enemy overshot. Holmes snapped a burst, caught only empty air, but forced separation. Barber reacquired the tumbling lead, Betty, now trailing down the sky like a dying comet. He followed briefly, ensuring there would be no miracle turn, no sudden rally. There was nothing but falling fire. Mitchell called curt corrections. Check high right. Maintain spread. His voice was gravity calm, anchoring, absolute. 2 minutes of combat felt like 20. Then the sky stilled. Smoke curled, debris glinted across the ocean's surface like shattered glass. Combat ended not with triumph, but with silence dense as grief. The air smelled faintly of oil and cordite even inside pressurized masks. The lightning formation regrouped on Mitchell's signal, angles tightened, wings leveling like synchronized breath. No one spoke celebration. They did not shout victory. They did not pump fists or cheer. They simply turned home. Barber glanced once toward where flames licked at jungle shadows far below. That was the grave of a strategist, a gambler, a man who had looked beyond battles toward nations and futures. He had believed in decisive strokes, in shock, in the brutal arithmetic of war. Mitchell's voice finally came. Get low. Get quiet. We go home. The P-38s descended to wave-skimming altitude once more, engines throttled back, fuel leaned, formation tight. The ocean rose up to greet them again, endless and absolute. Behind them, Japan would soon learn its greatest naval mind was gone. Ahead, Guadalcanal and safety beckoned distant but reachable. They had done the impossible. They had proven that distance was not barrier, surprise not sovereign, geography not destiny. They had taken intelligence, mathematics, industrial might, and pilot skill, and turned them into a single calculus of annihilation. For the American pilots, adrenaline drained, leaving only clarity and fatigue. The sea shimmered under noon sun, sweat cooled under flight jackets. Hearts still beat fast, not from fear now, but from the lingering echo of violence perfectly executed. Lanphier checked his fuel gauge. Barber wiped sweat from his brow. Mitchell rechecked headings by dead reckoning. No medals pinned in that moment, no cheers waiting on the sea. Just the hum of engines, the rumble of national will, the knowledge that history had pivoted in the air behind them. Somewhere in the wind, rushing past cockpit glass, a truth whispered. The empire that believed oceans would protect it just learned oceans can betray too. And the P-38s flew on silver, relentless, silent as judgment. The Pacific stretched ahead of them like eternity poured flat. The P-38s ran low over the water, their shadows skimming foam crests, propellers biting humid air in steady rhythm. Every vibration, every cough of engine note, every twitch of needle on a gauge felt magnified. The danger was not past. It simply changed shape. To survive, the ambush was triumph. To return home, that was the test. Fuel margins were razor thin. One miscalculation, one unexpected headwind, one over-rich mixture, and a lightning would fall into water so deep it had no color name. Commander John W. Mitchell checked his stopwatch again. Not because he doubted his math, but because reality had to be verified, trusted, and respected. Flight time consumed, nearly 3 hours outbound, fewer minutes in engagement, now return leg unfolding like a taut rope slowly uncoiling. His voice touched the radio only when needed. Check mixture, check temps, interval hold. Simple words, life-preserving ones. Behind him, Lieutenant Rex T. Barber flew with jaw clenched, eyes alternating between horizon and gauges. Sweat dried into salt on his cheeks. He replayed the attack not with triumph, but with precision angles, bursts, energy states. Was his lead perfect? Did he waste ammunition? Did his turn radius bleed speed? Victories, to men of that breed, were lessons, not celebrations. Beside him, Lieutenant Thomas Lanphier sat inside his cockpit with a different tension, a pressure rising from within. He believed his rounds had struck Yamamoto's bomber. He believed history had pivoted under his guns. In his mind lived the beginning of a narrative, one he would later fight to control. But now, in thin cockpit air, there was only heat, salt, silence, and the discipline of survival. Guadalcanal was still hours far. By the 90-minute mark of return leg, fatigue took shape. Not exhaustion, mental abrasion, the kind that erodes judgment in fractions, not leaps. Flyers whispered checks into helmets: fuel, oil, RPM, mixture, compass, horizon. A mantra spoken in engines and nerves. Mitchell broke silence again, voice level, measured. Watch the sun. We drift north if we trust compass alone. Magnetic deviation. The small, unglamorous truth of Pacific flying. Clouds formed ahead, distant thunderheads stalking the sea like black fortresses. Mitchell adjusted heading by single degrees, his mind juggling wind estimates, endurance charts, and dead reckoning lines scribbled in the pre-dawn dark hours before takeoff. They flew past empty ocean mile after empty ocean mile. Somewhere below, currents tugged at coral bones of forgotten ships. Sharks traced lazy arcs. Salt spray hung suspended in humid haze. Nobody thought of glory. Nobody thought of headlines. They thought of fuel needles and the thin film of metal separating them from drowning in silence. The Pacific did not care about heroes. Far behind, jungle smoldered. Japanese infantry patrols, moving through humid underbrush, stumbled upon twisted aluminum. They found the wreck of the lead Betty first nose buried, tail sheared, wings sprawled like broken dragonfly limbs. A soldier's diary later recovered recorded the sight. The admiral sat as if alive, his sword untouched, his face calm. The sky betrayed him. Local villagers whispered prayers for the dead, even the enemy dead, for in the islands death was not foreign. It was a tide that visited all shores. News would not remain hidden long. Rumor outran telegram. Shock outran disbelief. In Tokyo, officers stared at decrypted field reports like men reading prophecy fulfilled. Yamamoto was not simply a commander. He was symbol, architect, myth. His loss hit like a blade driven into the heart of imperial confidence. But those tremors had not yet reached the pilots flying home. By hour 5 of flight, the smell of hot oil drifted into cockpits. Engines complained in subtle ways. Turbos whined tired, like war horses near collapse. Each pilot now rode not only machine but belief in training, in math, in luck withheld and luck spent. Mitchell saw land first, a faint smudge on the horizon. The Solomon Islands. Green salvation rising from metallic sea. Still no celebration. The mission demanded stealth to the final moment. One Japanese scout float plane, one patrol boat, one listening post could unravel the secrecy that made this mission possible. Mitchell keyed his mic again. Radio silence continues. No chatter, no victory calls. They crossed coastline and the jungle below breathed welcome in steam and heat. Coconut palms leaned under breeze. Dirt runways baked in midday sun. Ground crew shaded eyes, staring as specks grew into shapes into aircraft, and then into the unmistakable twin-boom silhouettes of P-38s returning from a mission that officially did not exist. One by one. Tires kissed crushed coral runway. Dust billowed, engines spooled down, popping and ticking as metal cooled. No banners, no band, no applause. Just mechanics running with chocks, armourers staring at empty belts, intelligence officers approaching with clipboards and eyes sharp as razors. Mitchell climbed down first, His boots hit earth like he had been holding gravity at bay for hours. He removed goggles, rubbed salt from his eyes, nodded once. Not triumph, confirmation. Barber landed next. He slid canopy open, exhaled long and slow, as if breathing out the ocean itself. No smile, just the stillness of a man who had walked close to fate and returned unburned. Lanphier jumped down with quicker energy, adrenaline unspent, heart still hunting a rhythm. A crew chief asked quiet, cautious. Lanphier answered simply, yes. Mitchell's glance over warned, no details. Not now. Inside a makeshift operations hut, maps pinned to plywood walls, the pilots sat not as heroes, but as witnesses bound by secrecy. Intelligence officers asked. Pilots answered. Precise, sparse, no embellishment, no speculation. Fuel. Minimal. Enemy escorts? 2 zeros. Engagement short. Primary target? Destroyed. No one said Yamamoto's name. Not in full. Not yet. Names could not exist in air where spies might listen. When Mitchell finished, he stood, saluted, and left. Others followed. Outside, heat greeted them again. War did not pause. Planes still had to fly tomorrow. Engines still had to be serviced. Men still had to eat, sleep, return to duty. History had pivoted, but duty did not. There would be no announcement, no public praise. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Night fell heavy and warm. Jungle insects sang. Distant surf whispered against coral. Guadalcanal's sky glimmered with stars sharp as needles. Barber lay on his bunk, staring at canvas ceiling. He did not dream of flames or falling bombers. He thought of fuel gauges, engine sounds, and the silent shape of jungle swallowing smoke. Lanphier, elsewhere, rehearsed how history might someday ask him what happened. Mitchell, in his tent, reopened maps not of glory, but of tomorrow's missions, because war cared nothing for symbolic victories. War fed on schedules, logistics, attrition, persistence. They slept knowing what they had done. They would not speak of it freely. Not now, not for years, not until governments chose truth's timing. But in the quiet tropical night, a truth hung in air, heavy as humidity. Distance was no shield. Secrecy was no armor. The sky now belonged to whoever mastered math, engines, and will. And on that day, beneath that sun, over that ocean, the United States had proven it could reach anywhere. History shifted on propeller blades that hummed like prophecies. And the men who flew home in silence carried the weight of a turning world. Night on Guadalcanal did not bring silence. It brought layers of sound, cicadas screaming in the trees, generators throbbing in the background, distant artillery rumbling like storms beyond mountains. But inside certain tents, inside certain corners of Henderson Field, there was a hush too deliberate to be coincidence. The men of the interception squadron lay in their cots, or sat on ammo crates, or smoked in half-light. They did not brag. They did not smile long. They had struck a blow few in military history had ever managed, not against a ship, not against a division, but against a mind. They had killed the architect, and they could not say so, not publicly, not loudly, not even to most of the men who shared their mess tables. War has many front lines. This one ran through lips, across tongues, inside throats. Silence was not discipline. Silence was duty. Before the next sunrise, whispers flickered through Japanese chain of command like sparks over dry jungle brush. Messages encrypted in naval code JN-25 began to tremble with panic. Appointment missed. Aircraft overdue. Inspection flight failed to arrive. Staff officers in Rabaul stared at radios with pale faces, tapping ash from cigarettes that hung forgotten between fingers. Mechanics stood around an empty patch of runway, as if Yamamoto might simply materialize because he always had before. He was not merely a commander. He was an institution, a strategist, as feared by his own nation as he was respected. When code clerks transmitted the first acknowledgement of loss to Tokyo, It travelled in clipped, numb phrasing words that tried to remain military precise yet trembled beneath their own gravity. The commander-in-chief did not return. Deep within Tokyo's naval command, one officer later interrogated after the war recalled the room falling into a silence so heavy it felt like drowning. A man who had believed in one truth his entire life murmured, "If Yamamoto can be killed, then Japan can be defeated." It was not grief he spoke, it was realization. Back on Guadalcanal, mechanics worked through dawn servicing the P-38s. Bullet holes counted, fuel screens checked for metal, gun barrels cleaned, belts reloaded. The war did not pause for history. One crew chief asked Barber in a whisper, "Sir, was it really him?" Barber adjusted his cap, eyes tired and unreadable. "We got the mission done, that's all." He walked away before questions could become burden. It was not modesty, it was duty. Intelligence orders hung over every sentence like the edge of a knife. Even ground crew sensed it something huge, shapeless, unsaid. They moved with extra care around the lightnings, wiping oil as if cleaning relics of some sacred event. Lanphier, meanwhile, paced, his strides measured, almost rehearsed. A man constructing memory even as he lived it. His hand occasionally formed a fist, opened again, formed once more. A sergeant polishing a canopy looked at him and muttered under breath, "To hear it before he does." Nobody answered. Pilots lived close to ego as surgeons lived close to blood. It was necessary. Yet there was a line between confidence and possession of narrative, and Lanphier, even now, was already stepping toward it. Near midday, a courier jeep rattled into base. Dust slapped the air. A major from intelligence stepped out with a sealed satchel. He gathered the pilots in a low wooden hut. Mitchell stood, arms folded, expression already set like granite. He knew what was coming, yet waited anyway, because soldiers don't anticipate orders, they receive them. The major read from typed pages. "Effective immediately. Discussion of yesterday's mission is restricted to authorized intelligence personnel. No details are to be shared. Operational secrecy remains paramount." Not a single pilot protested, but eyes tightened, muscles tensed. Men who had stared down death at ranges measured in heartbeats now felt the weight of silence settle heavier than any. Zero formation. Then came the line that struck deepest. "The public will not be informed of the specifics of the mission. Release at a future time will be at the discretion of Navy Department." Mitchell nodded once. Others followed. Barber exhaled slow. Lanphier blinked hard, ambition paused, not erased. Across the ocean, Tokyo's radio crackled that same evening with announcements wrapped in ceremony. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, while directing operations at the front line, has met heroic death in battle. The Emperor's court issued mourning. Funeral drums rolled across courtyards, flags lowered. A nation that claimed loyalty unto death suddenly tasted mortality in its highest ranks. Some Japanese officers refused to accept American interception. They clung to comforting fiction. No enemy pilot could find him. It must have been accident. Others whispered the darker, truer fear. The Americans knew his route. They knew his time. How? Inside Rabaul, officers studied burned fuselage fragments and bullet strikes on jungle leaves. They found 5-0 caliber slugs lodged in bark. They knew the truth even before intelligence realized the same. This was not chance. This was not luck. This was mathematics, code work, industrial power, and pilots guided by unseen minds. Back at Henderson Field, night once again wrapped the island in damp air. Pilots gathered around a lantern. No toasts, no boasting. They spoke in fragments, half-formed sentences, memories sharpened and dulled at once. Barber finally broke the hush. "None of us touches this story again until Washington says so." Lanphier inhaled slowly, then nodded. His voice quiet but holding that steel thread inside it. When they do tell it, they'd better tell it right. Barber looked away. Mitchell said nothing at all. But the room felt the spark, that future tension, that unspoken duel, not of guns, but of history itself. Who shot first? Who fired true? Who would history crown when truth remained locked behind orders? Before dawn, orders for a new escort mission arrived. Same briefing room, same maps, same weary pencil stubs and creased charts. A new target, a new flight plan, a new sunrise to fly into. Mitchell briefed like always, no change in tone, no pause to savor yesterday. The enemy will adapt, we keep flying, we keep punching. Barber strapped into cockpit again, hands steady, expression flat. He did not chase memory, he chased duty. Lanphier buckled into harness with jaw clenched, already rehearsing futures. Engines roared again, props blurred again. The island shook with power and purpose again. Victory does not allow rest. History does not wait for ceremony. And heroes, when they are real, do not pause to polish legend. They strap in and go back to war. Far from the Solomons, in Washington and Honolulu and Pearl Harbor, officers sealed documents, sanitized reports, filed coded dispatches. A single line would eventually circulate in whispers among command. The Admiral sleeps in Bougainville. But on this island airfield, under palms and humidity and the dull ache of duty, pilots knew only one truth. They had crossed an ocean to kill an idea, and having done so, they would now return to the sky, because the war did not end with Yamamoto. It pivoted. And somewhere in that humid dawn breeze, amid the scent of oil and salt and endless Pacific wind, a quiet certainty rose. Victory belonged not to men who celebrated, but to men who continued. Even when history was still too classified to recognize them, even when truth lived only in sealed envelopes, even when the only witnesses were clouds and salt water and silence, they had changed the air war. Now they would fly on. Ned. The ground crews kept tuning engines. Pilots kept flying sorties against convoys and jungle positions. Intelligence officers kept shuffling papers beneath the whine of ceiling fans. The war did not slow. For history's sake, it never does. Yet something subtle had shifted. Beneath the camouflage nets and canvas roofs, beneath the daily rhythms of sweat and maintenance, the air carried a tension that wasn't there before. Every man in Mitchell's flight group knew they had done something that would echo far beyond Bougainville, but they were forbidden to speak its name. Barber walked the flight line in silence most evenings, cigarette ember glowing faintly in the dark. Mechanics would salute, waiting for orders, and he would nod absently, his mind half a world away back over the sea, seeing the flame of a falling bomber reflected in his canopy glass. He didn't think of victory, only of precision. How close they had come to running out of fuel, how one gust of wind might have changed everything. Lanphier, meanwhile, began drafting notes at first, scribbled between missions times, headings, bullet trajectories. He told himself it was just to make the record accurate when the operation was eventually declassified, but already a deeper need was forming, to preserve his version of the moment before someone else claimed it. Mitchell saw it coming. He'd commanded too many men not to recognize when ego starts to pull against discipline. He spoke little, but his looks carried weight. History will sort it out, he told them once, during a rare evening in the officers' mess. Our job's to finish the war, not the story. No one argued. But silence does not erase ambition. It only buries it until time and circumstance give it air. Across the Pacific, Japan's state funeral for Admiral Yamamoto unfolded in operatic sorrow. Photographs from that day, later captured and studied by Allied analysts, showed columns of officers bowing before a shrine of chrysanthemums and incense. The radio broadcast carried phrases that felt both proud and broken. He died in battle, sword in hand, fulfilling his duty as a warrior. Yet, inside Japan's naval command, reality gnawed at ceremony. The loss of Yamamoto was more than the death of a man. It was the death of belief that the empire could strike faster, think further, and endure longer than the enemy. He had been the advocate of restraint, the only senior officer who truly understood American industry's scale. With him gone, moderation died too. What followed would be fanaticism unmoored from logic. In Allied intelligence offices from Pearl Harbor to Washington, codebreakers read intercepted Japanese traffic that trembled with disbelief. Words like irreplaceable, divine will, and unthinkable, repeated in JN-25 fragments. They did not celebrate. They analyzed. They confirmed that the Japanese had not changed their cipher proof that the risk had been worth it. The enemy still spoke in the same mathematical language. The ears of HYPO still heard every whisper. In early May, official communiques reached Admiral Chester Nimitz's staff. The report was factual, clinical, stripped of emotion. Operation Vengeance completed. Primary target confirmed destroyed. A brief paragraph described the flight, the range, the result. No names, no faces, no adjectives. For the men who had flown the mission, that absence of recognition was both relief and ache. To remain invisible meant they had done their jobs perfectly. But invisibility weighs heavy on pilots whose lives balance between seconds of brilliance and years of routine. Colonel H.H. George, the 13th Fighter Command's intelligence chief, visited the squadron later that month. He shook Mitchell's hand and said quietly, "History will know, when it can afford to." It was meant as comfort. It sounded like exile. When news finally broke, weeks later filtered through cautious press releases and phrased to protect the secret of code breaking, the headlines read simply, "Admiral Yamamoto killed in action." The details were absent. No mention of P-38s, of the 4-hour flight, of mathematical precision. To the public, it seemed chance, an air patrol's lucky encounter. In New York and Chicago, newspapers printed editorials about poetic justice. Radio announcers called it retribution for Pearl Harbor. Families cheered in kitchens, unaware of the men who had risked everything to turn intelligence into execution. At Henderson Field, the announcement played over shortwave. A few pilots looked up from breakfast, a few nodded. No one clapped. Barber stubbed his cigarette out against a mess tin and murmured, "Guess the world just found out what we already knew." Lanphier smiled thinly. "Yeah," he said, "but they don't know how." Mitchell looked at both men and left the table. Weeks later, promotion orders arrived, routine recognition for efficiency and leadership. Mitchell moved up in rank quietly. Barber earned commendation. Lanphier received public notice, his version of the story already taking shape in post-mission interviews. The official record left ambiguity deliberate or bureaucratic, perhaps both. Barber and Lanphier would spend decades arguing through reports, statements, and affidavits about who fired the fatal burst. The U.S. Army Air Forces, then later the Air Force itself, would re-examine evidence half a century later before finally concluding that Barber's rounds struck the lead bomber first. But at the time, the distinction was academic. The victory belonged to intelligence, to logistics, to the combined calculation of men and machines. Still, among the squadron, that quiet friction lingered. In the mess tents, some sided with Barber's steady humility. Others admired Lanphier's eloquence, his drive to make the mission known. But Mitchell discouraged gossip. "You want to argue after the war," he said once. "For now, the enemy's still out there." By late 1943, the air war had changed. The lesson of the Yamamoto interception reshaped Allied planning. Intelligence and range could replace chance. Precision could replace luck. The P-38 Lightning, once dismissed as awkward, became the long arm of air dominance from the Solomons to New Guinea. Japan, deprived of its grand strategist, began to flounder. Coordination between Army and Navy fractured. Supply convoys dwindled under relentless American interception. The Empire had lost its mathematician of war and did not know how to replace him. At Henderson Field, the men who made that equation real kept flying, kept fighting, kept losing friends. Victory was not a single mission, it was 1,000 smaller ones stacked upon it. But deep down, every time they throttled forward and lifted off into the morning heat, they carried the knowledge that oceans no longer protected the enemy. The Pacific had become finite. The sky had become American, and in every coded transmission HYPO decrypted thereafter, in every cautious Japanese order that now bore hesitation instead of certainty, the echo of 1 April, morning remained, a name, a flight plan, a precise time written in numbers, the equation that changed the air war forever. By mid-1943, the Pacific had become an equation written in steel, fuel, and distance. Operation Vengeance had proven that intelligence and precision could close any gap, that the sky itself could be measured, solved, and conquered. What remained was to understand the arithmetic beneath the triumph, the balance sheet of empire and exhaustion. At Lockheed's Burbank plant, the P-38 Lightning was rolling off production lines faster than mathematics could chart, 1 aircraft every hour. Each airframe a product of 3,000 subcontractors, 25,000 rivets, and a labor network stretching from Michigan's aluminum mills to the refineries of Louisiana. By the spring of 1943, the United States was producing nearly 8,000 combat aircraft every month. Japan, by contrast, built fewer than 1,500, most by hand, under the pounding of Allied bombers. The war had become not a contest of pilots, but of logistics density. Every sortie flown by a P-38 rested on a pyramid of laborers, chemists, typists, and engineers, an invisible army of arithmetic. The Americans had turned warfare into a manufacturing problem. The Japanese, still believing in valor, would discover that courage could not refuel an empty tank. At Pearl Harbor's basement room's Station HYPO, the analysts resumed their work, sleeves rolled up, pencils clicking, coffee gone cold beside decoding sheets. Operation Vengeance was filed, archived, and replaced by the next message burst. Intelligence officers did not celebrate. They calculated. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton later described the atmosphere as grim satisfaction. They had proven that decryption could kill, but they also knew it could never be revealed. Each intercepted message was a window into the enemy's nerves, and windows stay valuable only while unseen. One young cryptanalyst, William Bundy, wrote in his diary, "We made mathematics into a weapon. It killed a man, but it also preserved thousands. The battle for the Pacific, he knew, was not only fought in cockpit and jungle, but in rooms lit by single bulbs, where silence had the same authority as gunfire." After Yamamoto's death, the air war accelerated into total rhythm. American pilots now fought with confidence that intelligence stood behind them, invisible and omnipresent. The Lightning squadrons of the 13th Air Force swept from Guadalcanal to New Georgia, Bougainville, and the Bismarcks. They flew with numbers, not luck. Fuel ratios calculated to decimal precision. Navigation charts corrected for magnetic deviation. Intercept paths modeled from intercepted radio chatter. War became geometry in motion. The Japanese, still relying on courage and chance, found themselves fighting not men but algorithms. In August 1943, during strikes on Kahili and Balale, lightning formations dove through flak with eerie coordination. They appeared, struck, vanished. Pilots compared it to hunting with a compass. The same mathematics that killed Yamamoto now guided entire fleets. At headquarters in Washington, Admiral Nimitz read the after-action summaries. He underlined one phrase from Mitchell's report. "Target located and destroyed at time and place predicted." It was not just victory, it was certainty. The Navy had found a way to wage war with predictive precision. For centuries, admirals had gambled. Now, with radio interception, cryptanalysis, and long-range aviation, the gamble was shrinking. General Henry Hap Arnold of the U.S. Army Air Forces saw something larger still. In a memo to his staff, he wrote, "We have entered an era where computation replaces coincidence." He ordered expansion of reconnaissance, radar, and long-range coordination, an embryonic form of what decades later would be called networked warfare. The Japanese still believed in spirit. The Americans now believed in systems. Even in death, Yamamoto haunted Allied minds. Some officers felt unease. The man had respected America once, had warned his government that war would awaken an industrial giant. His prophecy had come true with brutal precision. When captured Japanese diaries were translated months later, they revealed a tone of despair. One officer wrote, "Our admiral's fate shows that the enemy's reach is infinite. If even he cannot be safe, what hope have we?" Morale sagged in far-flung outposts from Rabaul to Truk. The Empire's pilots began to feel hunted before they even took off. The Americans, meanwhile, quietly studied those psychological ripples. Intelligence analysts annotated them as proof that strategic decapitation could yield effects disproportionate to tonnage of bombs dropped. It was the first data point in a doctrine that would shape future wars, the idea that killing leadership could fracture an entire system. At Guadalcanal, Mitchell's men continued their routine. Barber kept flying, Lanphier kept writing. By year's end, both had returned to the state's heroes unrecognized, stories half told. Mitchell himself remained with his command, thin from malaria, older than his years. When a young replacement pilot asked him once about the Yamamoto raid, he replied only, "We found him where numbers said he'd be." Then he changed the subject. It was not modesty, it was clarity. The mission had not been about vengeance. It had been about control of information, about turning intelligence into trajectory, theory into fire. In later years, when Mitchell was asked if he ever regretted the secrecy, he answered, "No, we weren't chasing credit. We were proving possibility." By 1944, the lessons of Operation Vengeance had evolved into strategy. Code-breaking centers spread across the Pacific. Fighter command merged navigation with cryptanalysis. Targeting became predictive, not reactive. The same mathematical rigor used to find one admiral would now guide the annihilation of convoys, airfields, and eventually cities. A line led from Yamamoto's cockpit to Hiroshima's mushroom cloud, a line drawn in numbers, intelligence, and the cold confidence that calculation could win wars faster than bravery could. Historians would later call it the birth of information warfare. Years after the war, when Barber and Lanphier appeared together at a reunion in 1965, the argument about who fired first had not died. The audience clapped for both. Mitchell, by then grey-haired, refused to take sides. He told a reporter, "The Pacific was big enough for both of them and small enough for none of us." He paused, looked toward the horizon, and added quietly, "What mattered was the math. Because that was the truth behind every flight, every bullet, every coded message. Mathematics had become destiny." And that destiny had been written in the sky over Bougainville on April 18, 1943, when a handful of men, guided by equations and silence, reached across an ocean and changed the air war forever.